Welcome, everyone, to the Relational Discipleship webinar. My name is Ebony Davis. I am a ministry researcher serving as Director of Research and Ministry Assessments for the youth worker community, and as a member of the Research Advisory Board for the 10 by 10 collaboration. I'm also a longtime youth pastor serving in a local multicultural church in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., for more than 20 years. And because of that, today's topic is deeply important to me. And I believe it's vital to anyone who cares about the faith resilience of young people. 10 by 10's vision is to make faith matter more for 10 million young people over the next 10 years, inspired by John 10:10. And this goal responds to research projecting that 10 million young people would drift away from the church over a decade. And so, one major way that 10 by 10 is addressing this challenge is by championing relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus in every faith community. And so last year, the 10 by 10 Research Advisory Board partnered with Future of Faith, led by Dr. Josh Packard and his team, to produce a white paper offering a comprehensive assessment of the current landscape of youth discipleship, especially the practice and the promise of relational ministry. And so this topic is so central to the future of youth ministry that it will also shape this year's Association of Youth Ministry Educators Conference. And that's happening on October 23rd through 25th in Dallas, Texas, where the white paper will be front and center. I am really excited to be conference chair this year, and I hope you are putting it on your calendar as we speak. Well, today we are honored to be joined by several contributors to the white paper. My panelists are Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Lockhart. She is the Associate Professor of Christian Education at Union Presbytery Seminary, womanist, play facilitator, innovative educator, and author, including her recent book, Doing Theological Double Dutch, A Womanist Pedagogy of Play. Dr. Kimberly Nolan is with us, and she is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Young Life. She has led numerous national and global studies on the faith of young people, including the Relate Project, exploring adolescents' relationships with themselves, with one another, and with faith. And Dr. Dave Ron, a veteran of over 50 years in youth ministry leadership, serving in academia and as vice president at Youth for Christ. He is a ministry researcher, author, futurist, missions leadership strategist, and the co-author with me of Grit and Joy, Help for Bewildered Families of Teens. And we are also really grateful to have Dr. Josh Packard and Brandon Wong from Future of Faith with us today. Josh is the co-founder of Future of Faith and the lead author of the Relational Discipleship White Paper, as well as the author of his new book, Faithful Futures, Sacred Tools for Engaging Younger Generations. And Brandon Wong is an associate researcher at Future of Faith and co-author of the white paper. So they're going to start us off. We're going to turn to Josh and Brandon for an overview of what they discovered through their research.
Wow, thank you so much, Ebony. That's such an incredible introduction, and what an honor to be on this panel. On this webinar with all of these amazing people who will show up in the panel later. As Ebony said, I'm the co-founder of Future of Faith, Josh Packard. This is Brandon Wong, and we were sort of leading up the efforts of Future of Faith on this white paper. And it was no small task. I mean, as Ebony said, it was commissioned, and Brandon, we thought this was going to be like, I don't know. Like I've been a professor, you've been a student. Like I thought we would do like a lit review and it would be like 10 to 12 pages or something. And it ended up being not that. It ended up being so much bigger. So one of the things that I think is really useful about the white paper as it ends up stretching to be more comprehensive than just sort of survey is that there's some nearly 200 footnotes and hundreds of sources in the bibliography. So let's just start there before we get into the findings. Brandon, can you talk about, because this is largely the effort, the part of it that you were sort of tasked with before we knew how big it would be. Talk a little about how you pulled all of these resources together.
Yeah, so I think a big piece of this project that we started with was wanting to make sure that it was sort of drawing from a diverse constituency of scholars and other folks just in the world of youth ministry. And so to start, we launched this survey that mostly went to scholars and then sort of expanded beyond that as we learned about more people whose voices were worth including. Um, and so that was where we started with the sources. We asked, like, what have been the most influential academic and otherwise sources in the world of youth ministry over the last 50 years. And so we sort of snowball sampled from that. We got more scholars, more sources. The database is now up to over 450 sources, and you can find that on our website. There will be links sort of here. And so, yeah, that's sort of how the database came together. And then obviously we drew on that in the white paper. So,
And I wouldn't normally start there. Like in a webinar about like the least interesting place to start is often with methods. But I think that it's so foundational to this story because one of the things that we've discovered, and part of the reason why it went from this initial scope of 10 to 15 pages up to what I think it ended up at 35 to 40 or something, is because we realized there was a story that wasn't being told. Like Brandon alluded to here, that this story had been about sort of youth ministry had been told, but in pieces. About youth ministry as a profession or youth ministry as a discipline or relational discipleship as a theology or concept. But bringing all that together meant that we had to also model the way that we wanted it to move forward. And that was from a very diverse perspective. And so then the actual database, the bibliography becomes critically important. And as Brandon mentioned, if you're watching this and you're a scholar or a student or something and you're looking for a place to start, you can go to our website. Brandon has done this great job of organizing all these into a table. Is it Notion, Brandon, it's in right now?
yeah, it's a database. Yeah.
And you can download it directly. But okay, so let's start with the sort of like, what did we find? We're not gonna go through like blow by blow through the white paper. You can download it, read it, it's free. But there are some things that I found to be particularly interesting and surprising to me as I was putting this together. So I come from the field of sociology, and we don't always get it diversity right. God knows. I mean, I don't want to make that claim, but I had sort of come into this with this idea that the scholarship around relational discipleship or relational ministry would be a bit more integrated. And one of the things that surprised me was that these perspectives still largely lived in silos, and that the history of this concept um, is one that sort of reflects the kind of history of inequality in the field, largely. That there are these incredibly useful, sort of more academic and professionalized strains. People like Mark Center had written textbooks that are foundational for a lot of this work. But then there's also this like incredible like lived tradition that is just now starting to make its way into sort of quote unquote official publications like academic journals that we had to uncover even through some sort of I guess really only came out in our interviews. So Brandon, you did a lot of those interviews. I mean, what did you learn by talking to people that we wouldn't have found just in a scan of the literature?
Yeah, I think what you already touched on with the lived piece, I think is really key there. We interviewed a lot of different folks, and I'm grateful to have had the chance to speak with them. But I think about an interview that I had, and just basically the scholar was telling me sort of the journey of their career, and sort of interwoven in that is just the publications and research that came up along the way. And so I think what was valuable to me was getting the backstory that informed each of these publications and how much youth ministry is not just sort of a field or line of work that people exist in as much as it is for many people a calling. And with that, there's so much more to sort of these works than just what they're finding. And I think that was
Yeah.
really meaningful to see.
Same. And we cite those conversations as sources in the white paper themselves. We commissioned essays from people to help cover bases that we couldn't otherwise cover. And what we learned there is like a lot of this stuff that is sort of like professionalized in largely, I'll say, white context, academic context, although the academic doesn't exclusively mean white by any stretch. We're also like very much just a part of the regular lived tradition, almost impossible to separate out as a particular like strain of youth ministry, right? That these relational approaches were just embedded in indigenous communities, in Hispanic and Latino communities, right? In African American communities where that was just the approach to ministry generally. And so that really expanded the kinds of places that we went and looked at, and we incorporated those into the draft the white paper itself. The other thing that came out that stuck out to me, again, social scientist, right? So not my lane, was just how much theology there is, especially emerging, that underlies this. And we've got Kim Nolan here from Young Life, and Young Life is really a sort of pioneer in the parachurch world about sort of establishing its like inroads into a lot of these relational approaches. But this incarnational approach that you know. This idea that young people are not worthy for who they will become, but for who they are now, was such like an aha moment for me, that to find that body of work and to see it stretched out from Wes Ellis and Andy Root to Elizabeth Conde Frazier and Hoffman Espino working in Catholic context, Latino context, like, and on and on. I mean, these are not the only ones, but that really gave me some like intellectual foothold into the theology of sort of why this relational approach is not just important tactically, but why this is sort of a sound theological place to start from. And then we jump into the model. Okay, so what do we find? We found there are sort of 5 key things here that we find support for. This is not going to be surprising for those of you who remember, we cover them blow by blow. Adults matter. Everybody's been saying this for forever. We find no reason to counter that in the literature. The adults matter in the lives of young people in a few ways. So having a significant parent or adult that's close to you matters, but also the adults in your community and in your families more broadly are critically important. That youth ministry in a relational way is not or should not be done. It is not the domain just of the youth minister. If your church is lucky enough to be able to support a youth minister partner full time, I think what the research points to is pretty clearly like that's not. You can't just sort of like put it over there and be like, oh, that's the youth minister's job, right, Brandon? And be like, okay, good, they got it. We can pay attention to other things.
Yeah, I think that was something that came up in the interviews as well. Just that youth ministry extends beyond sort of this professional sphere, and it really is something that happens in these sort of relationships between adults and youth that emerge organically. I think those seem to be sort of the most meaningful things, both on the parts of the adults and as well as the youth.
Indeed. But there were two, but all of that made sense to me. And I think, it was pretty clear from the national studies that sociologists like me tend to consume. But there were 2 other parts that were surprising. And one was faith applied through service, and the other is the importance of internal spiritual practices. And as we dug more into it, I realized like I shouldn't have been surprised. It just wasn't a part of my domain, but it's nice to have them captured here. And in particular, it's this notion of faith applied through practices, which gets us a little bit into um, Dave Ron's work. He's one of the panelists that you'll hear from in a second too. This idea that relational discipleship is important not as like not only as a tactic to rebuild trust in a world that doesn't trust institutions. I mean, it is useful for that, but it's relational discipleship with the eye towards being, to use Dave's words, radically focused on Jesus, right? That these internal spiritual practices become critical for their formation. And I think here too of Mike King's work at Youth Front, that kids can handle this. Like they are interested in like these deeply theological conversations, that it doesn't have to be, smoke machines and, bands and compelling preaching, although those things can be useful too, but it doesn't have to stop there. That the theology is really critical. Okay, so we'll just wrap up this part, Brandon. There's still a few things I think that are missing from this field. There's voices that are still kind of left out, and I'll name one of them. I'm curious if you have some others. So one of the things that stuck out to me was the way that like disability, neurodivergence, that is a whole conversation that the church doesn't seem. I mean, Aaron Rafferty and a few others are like having that conversation, but it's not like full on embraced yet, and we could do with more of that. What about you? What was left for you as a question or direction or a voice that isn't there yet?
Yeah, I think something that I think about is just youth voice. And I would be really curious to know, like, what is the experience of the youth, right? We have this very rich wealth of experience and knowledge from scholars, from adults, youth ministers themselves. But I think a really valuable and yet missing perspective here is what is the experience of the youth, whether it's the youth now or folks who have grown up and gone on to be sort of youth ministers or adults in churches. Yeah.
That's a really good point. To see more scholarship that is qualitative in nature, and using lots of different methods actually to incorporate youth voices. We do a lot of photo voice projects at Future Faith. That could be interesting. I hadn't even thought about that yet. Okay, great. Well, please do check out the white paper. We have this whole framing of like questions we started with and questions we still have. We'd love for you to take those up in your own work and scholarship. I mean, this seems like ready made for somebody who's either writing a term paper or even a master's or PhD thesis if this is of interest to you. So I'll invite Ebony back on, but you can find the white paper at our website at Future of Faith.
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's an amazing paper. You guys did great work. So just want to really thank you for the work that you did. And as Josh was pointing out, this paper was always meant to be sort of a launching pad, right? It's not meant
Yeah.
to answer all of the questions. It just tells us what is out there.
Oh yeah,
and
we
so
talk about it as first word, not final word.
That's right.
Right?
First word,
Yeah.
not final. That exactly. And so as we think about, how we can use this paper to sort of launch either in our classrooms, in the conferences that we attend, this is really an ongoing work that all of us in the community need to come together so that we can make faith matter more for the young people that we're encountering. With that said, I'm going to invite our panelists to come back on, Lakeisha and Kim and Dave, so that we can maybe start to just scratch the surface at some of these questions. I'd love to start and welcome. Thank you all for coming. We're so glad that you joined us and agreed to be here today. Um, I'd love to start, and I'm going to throw this one first at Lakeisha. What spiritual practices do you think actually help young people to grow? And how do we adapt them for cultural humility and accessibility and intergenerational belonging and all of those things? What would you say to that?
Thank you. What a great place to start. But thanks for having me. I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. If I were thinking about what spiritual practices actually help young people grow today, I would say those that deeply engage their body and not just their mind. Young people want to be fully and deeply embodied, not just part of who they are, but all of who they are, right? So that means inviting practices that are movement based, creativity. I'm a big person to play. So I'm like, yes, play. But help them really internalize their faith so that it's something lived and not just something learned, but that it's deeply embodied. So thinking about other playful arts, music, drama, breath prayers, we have walking liturgies, communal limits, lots of justice-oriented service things are also very practice-based as well, but really just honoring the body. If I'm thinking about how we adapt them, I think you said cultural humility, accessibility, and intergenerational belonging. I would say if we're really going to think about cultural humility, we have to start with young people and where they are. So that means talking to them, figuring out where they are, where are their stories, what is their rituals, where are they finding meaning, and how we make them more ritualized, how we make them some more of these practices instead of just giving them kind of this one size fits all practice and curriculum. This is how we do it. Start with them, start with their voice. If we're thinking about accessibility, right? Can people even get into the building? I mean, very basic things. Right? Can we even get in to do the practices? Right? Have we dimmed the lights to think about neurodivergent? Like how things are affected? Have we thought about sound? Have we thought about using, noise canceling headphones? Like, have we thought about how even in these practices there can be other ways and things that we can do? And if as we're doing these practices, we're thinking about intergenerationally, then what does that mean that they could do these with their grandparents or their younger siblings or whomever? Like storytelling, or sharing meals and cooking together, or collaborative art. I just think there's lots of things and ways to co-create meaning, and I think it has to really start with body work.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Lakeisha, especially as someone who works in a multicultural setting. And I think about sometimes when we're thinking about, diverse ministry or multicultural ministry, we're thinking on a really big term or on a really big scale, right? And so we're thinking, what does this group feel or this group feel? And we're forgetting that youth culture is a subculture within each one of those cultures, right? And so I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Kim, how would you answer that question? What spiritual practices actually help young people grow? And how do we adapt them for cultural humility, accessibility, and intergenerational belonging?
Yeah, I agree with Lakeisha with everything that you have said, being especially the embodied part. And one of the things that I've become more aware of in being with young people is the great need for silence and for the opportunity in creating space for people to be aware of how you're feeling. It's hard to be embodied if you're not really even aware of what's going on in your body. And I think that those spaces also facilitate, contemplation and action. And so I loved what you said, Lakeisha, of like marrying that contemplation with serving other people. And just a simple one that I would offer to the community is the examine. I feel like that is a really accessible practice. It can be very short or long. It can be intergenerational. It fits for just about every person type. And it really does facilitate that space where you have a chance to be reflective on what you are grateful for. It gives you a space to be aware of what's going on in your past and in your future and what your hopes are. It builds the muscles of discernment, and it reminds us, most of all, that we are the Lord's beloved. And I believe from that place, then we are able to move into a space of action.
Thank you. I love that. I love that. And reminding us that we are the Lord's beloved. I love that. I'm thinking about the people that might be watching this webinar, and it's going to be going out to all kinds of youth ministry professors and educators in different contexts, and their students are going to be sitting in the rooms, and just on a very practical, I guess, level. When we think about these students that are entering ministry now, um, we're going to be talking to them about relational discipleship, right? And so, what is it going to cost them to practice relational discipleship instead of relational programming? What's that going to look like? Dave, jump in, and then anybody else from there.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to say how I found myself drifting backwards and going, why weren't people like Letitia and Kim and Ebony on my team when I was doing direct ministry back, 800 years ago? That was just, man, I would have loved just brainstorming and thinking into this together. And there's something at the heart and soul of my understanding of ministry right now that keeps pulling me that direction. To your question, Ebony, I think relational discipleship is going to cost students speed, scale, and supposed security of control. And I think that to unpack that a bit, I think that there's an efficiency driver inside of a lot of ministry practices that make us want to, hit the mark on time and then hit it in a big way. And so you have to, show why what you're doing here is going to lead to something huge and amazing. And then it translates into work efforts every week for people that look like you got things under control, and you can account for things that are under control. I think it really defies the way that Jesus taught in terms of like reference the parable in Mark chapter 4 about the farmer and the seed and it grows all by itself. Whether the farmer does, I mean, there's a mystery in this process that, in fact, is heart and soul what's going on. So we get to relational discipleship delivers people as a sort of an offering to Jesus, not programs as an offering to Jesus. And when Jesus gets a chance to sort of say, "You've been faithful," he's talking about not programs typically. And I think that's where relational discipleship actually sits there, and it tussles a little bit with our limited capacity, doesn't it? I mean, that you're going to put your time and effort into something, and a lot of times efficiency and image management is where we're at with ministry, and we try to promote and promote and promote and all of that stuff. And I think there's a way of being authentic and present in what forms people. And if I could, pair those words and especially lock them into this notion of abiding with Jesus, I think that that actually has impact on how we spend our time, what our vision is, and the fruit that we get to connect ourselves to.
That's good. That's good. It reminds me as you were talking, Dave, kind of what was popping in my mind is this idea of an imperfect process. And we don't like that when we're in when we're in youth ministry, that we have to accept that it's going to be an imperfect process. Yeah, Kim or Lakeisha, jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly. But I mean, yes, again, with already been said, I think I would just add another cost is I think what we call like comfort or inherent safety. I feel like I generally don't use the term safety or like safe space anymore after I had a young man that told me he was not safe in the space and as a person, young man of color, and not to promise him something I couldn't deliver. And it was the space of remembering what can I provide in the space. Maybe it can be brave, maybe it can be courageous, it can be sacred. But if I can't promise everyone safety in the same way, because different bodies are safe in different ways and they need different things to feel that. And if we can't do that, sometimes we're doing a disservice. And so when I think about as we're like moving into relationship, we have to like begin to decenter and decolonize a lot of these ways of doing things and really start lifting up a lot of these, other cultural ways of being that even us as ministers or people that the ways that we've done it is uncomfortable or we don't feel that way, but realizing that, whether we're thinking about, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, API, disability, differently abled, LGBTQIA, rural, immigrant, like realizing that all of these voices, what would it mean to like let them shape the space, like to listen to their questions, to listen to their practices. And that's going to cost us time. I think, as you said, Dave, we got to move slower. We have to listen more deeply and we have to really hear what they're having to say if we're really wanting to engage in relationship, which requires more mutuality. It requires more shared power, requires more deep, deep honesty, which includes sometimes our uncomfortability as leaders and ministers.
Lakeisha, I really appreciate what you just said, especially around the notion of time. I think that relational ministry is inefficient, and we need to be comfortable with how inefficient it is. I believe it yields tremendously over time, but we may never see the results of the investments that we make relationally. And so it's letting go of what we are hoping for as an immediate outcome and knowing that the time that we're spending, wasting time together, actually is really important.
That's so good. That's so good. And so I'm hearing all of us say, we got to, as you said, Kim, put so well, we got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable because this is not easy when it's not packaged up for us and we can check all the boxes. I love that.
I'm going to make a quick confession here for a second. The word uncomfortable is right now my password to open my computer. So I might have to change it now, but that's why it's so important.
You probably should change it, but that was awesome. That's great. So when I think about just from my context, when I think about relational discipleship, and here's a confession, another confession, but it's not my password. When we first started talking about relational discipleship, I, as a youth pastor, have kind of been following what the youth ministry world told me. This is what I was supposed to do. This is what it was supposed to make work. This is how it works. And then the whole relational discipleship thing kind of really blew up, and we said, no, this is the way to resilient faith among young people. And there was a part of me that said, well, wait a minute, that's what we were doing in the first place in the African American church, right? That's what you did. You sat next to Sister so and so, and she discipled you through, through life, really. And so this question is, what ministry practices from marginalized, immigrant, rural, and culturally rooted communities might surprise youth ministers when considered essential rather than add-ons? Lakeisha, help us out.
Yeah, I was like, guys, let me. No, I love this question because it's usually like the small things that we think are the one-offs, right? It's the special cultural Sunday or the sharing the meal or the festival or the bilingual worship or the call and response in worship, right? Or the public testimony, the collaborative services. All like those are not just decorations. Those are things that are just genuinely part of like practices of like identity formation, of communal memory, of like intergenerational care, like of sharing these meals and recipes together, of having worship bilingual when maybe you don't know all the words, but you're learning, like having these public tests. The call and response are very deeply cultural and embodied, right? And those are part of how we do that. Ancestor remembrance, land-based rituals that people do. All of those are deeply part of it. Sensory-friendly worship, when we want to talk more about our differently abled and disabled and neurodivergent friends. Sensory-friendly worship, nonverbal participation, even like maybe not even just the having to verbalize things, but giving people like all of those but they need to not be periphery. Like they're usually just add-ons. Oh, we're just going to throw this in. No, what if it becomes part of every service, a part of everything that we're doing, and like really start to infuse it? Like that's part of also how we're growing in faith, how we build a relationship and learning and doing a lot of these practices, moving them from periphery and just special Sundays to every time, all the things, and letting it be there. But all of those practices matter in so many ways.
Okay, Dave, jump in.
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of the most ennobling activities I've had. About 20 years ago, I pulled together the team of national leaders in Youth for Christ who were over different ministries. So there's Campus Life, there was City Life, there was Juvenile Justice Ministries, there was Deaf Teen Quest, there was camps. When we got together for 3 days, and the task was to try to come up with what we called the essentials. Everybody, like everybody in the movement, and all the diversity and all the things that we were all about. And it was, once we powered through our initial advocacies, we settled on the conviction that this is a question about theological faithfulness before it is anything else. If you are going to say to anybody, I get the privilege of going to Nepal here in a few months to teach people. I'm going, what in the world do I have to say to Nepalese people in their context? And I'm going, my only confidence is a theological faithfulness there. And then there's something about listening really well that's rooted in theological stuff, that's rooted in the practice of Jesus. It's how you love people. It's that kind of thing. And then when the particulars spill out, they look a little different in different contexts. So I'm all about essential ministry practices that are rooted here in this kind of theological reflection. And if I can make this observation, and maybe confess, I think over the years, too much of our training in youth ministry has short-circuited deep theological understanding as a driver. As a result, we're more vulnerable to the winds of the time, and probably aren't as deeply connected to the Lord Jesus in this agenda as we need to be.
Right, deep theological. I love the deep theological reflection and the essentials, focusing on the essentials. I love that. Kim?
Well, you guys have really covered so much already. The only thing I would add is I think about Jesus and his ministry and what he did. He showed up. And I think that is a lot of what we need to be doing in this space. We used to say at Young Life that you would show up to be able to earn the right to be heard. And now we've kind of even changed that to we show up so that we could earn the right to listen. That by being a present person, we are creating a space where we can build relationships with young people and listen to their stories and be the holders of those stories. And so really it is kind of coming in open-handed and letting the Lord do the work and not having expectations of or an agenda of I'm showing up because nope, you're just showing up and waiting for the Lord to move and see what's going to happen.
Thanks, Kim. What that also brings to mind for me is sort of this idea of simplicity, right? We've so overcomplicated. And when I think about these communities, the marginalized, immigrant, rural, all of these communities, one thing that a lot of them have in common, because they didn't have the big budgets and all of those things, is they had this simplicity that allowed them to show up, that allowed them to be present, that said, hey, you better focus on theological faithfulness, right? Because we don't have all of these other things to crowd that out with. And so when I think about those communities, the beauty of the simplicity really speaks volumes to me in my own ministry experience. But we do have opportunities to have big moments, right? And so many ministries will rely on events or trips and big moments, and we know those are important, right? We don't take anything away from them. They're important in my own ministry, so those are important minutes. But how can future youth workers, this current students link these catalytic experiences with long-term relational formation? Dave, kick us off with this one.
Yeah, first of all, I want to confess that this is a skill set that I have in some ways, and maybe part of my personality to be catalytic a little bit, and so I have a bias. I'll say it that way, and it's for those things. But I come to also understand that they need to be stewarded correctly. These really matter a lot, but they cannot sustain the weight of long-term relational formation. So, the question I have for myself even is like, how do they fit rather than misdirect or misguide? How do they not necessarily replace ministry or even be the first agenda of ministry, but how do they flow into the bigger deal? And I think of them as relationship front doors. Either they're sort of introductory, or they invite you to a deeper room. Come on into this other layer here where we can have a sit down conversation that doesn't feel like it's got a lot of bells and whistles. And why are you uncomfortable here? Why I just helping just move deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think it's crucial to understand how inadequate they are is as a priority, even though they're flashy. And there's a lot of people in the pews and our funding bases who like to hear those stories, and they just are attractive that way. But that feeds our promotional instincts more than it does the real work of transformation. Abiding with Jesus is the only thing I trust to govern my availability to love others. And so there is this. I love Kim's insight about showing up. Just show up to listen, and that show up without agenda is actually a little bit of a paper over. I do have an agenda. I want to listen to Jesus about what in the heck my agenda should be. Now I'm really fully present here, and so I love that, and my availability to others in a moment is part of the agenda. Long-term discipleship is in the category of attachments that we're called to steward faithfully, and catalytic experiences can serve that, but they shouldn't try to presume on top of that.
That's good. Lakeisha, jump in here.
Yeah, I just want to second that. So much of that is that it's the trip isn't the main point. The thing, the big event isn't the point. It's how it gets woven into our daily ecology, right? Of relationship and practices and how we shape. It's not just this. I feel like a friend of mine, we use this like this isolated spiritual high that we get during the moment, but it's not like literally woven into what we do. And so I guess one of the things, like as in, the religious educator in me, is I love like so what we do at our institutions is we have like work that we do before we go somewhere, because we also have trips that we take, right? We go abroad. And so we do work before. So whether it's like, playful rituals or something that you do before, like before you go, you do things during your time there, actual practices that are grounding you while you're there. And then when you're coming back, like what are some things that you're returning with? Maybe it's, you're doing an art project or a testimony service, or following up with small groups, or, having to tell the adults about your trip, or so something like that. But how do we kind of keep these practices going? I think that the white paper is actually, uses the language of practice-based formation and in-service learning cycles, right? And how we think about the rhythm of what we're doing, the preparation, experience, reflection, integration, like how we integrate all of that really, really well, so that it doesn't just stay this isolated high, but becomes something that's more sustainable and like part of your actual lived faith and experience, that we continue to ground these wonderful spiritual highs that we have in our daily life.
Thanks so much. That's good. I'm thinking about, so we now say, okay, we're going to move into this relational model. And we know that, as we've already discussed, it's kind of hard to gauge things, to talk to our donors, when we're having this relational model. We're not going to use these big moments, right? So it's great to say, oh, I'm going to gauge things about how many people show up at this camp or this event. If we're trying to help emerging youth pastors sort of move away from this model and say, these aren't the most important things, then Kim, I'll start with you. How should they evaluate fruitfulness in youth ministry without falling into this sort of numbers trap, the attendance-based track?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it really does require a lot of intentionality and thought. And I think it's fine to count numbers at big events or small events. And it's great. You want to know who's in the room, right? But beyond that, I really feel like for evaluation, we really want to tie what we are doing to our mission statement or our strategic plan to be kind of more business-like. But practically what that means is, what do we hope is different by doing the things that we are doing, by having a youth ministry program? What does it look like if things are different? And then how will I know if I've accomplished it? And so I think asking those questions of what do we hope is different? What does that look like if things were different on the other end of whatever we're doing at the end of 2 years? And then how will I know if I have gotten there? And so I think it's really starting to change our focus to measure things that are more along faith formation, or maybe it's measuring things like belonging or close relationships or identity, believing I am worthy of being loved because I am a child of God. It's agency or service. And because we know all of those things together do increase faith and they increase flourishing. And so I think looking at, like, what are some of those bigger constructs that we might want to look at? And there are free assessments available, like if we wanted to survey our kids or something like that. But it can also be looking at behaviors like gratitude or being able to listen, or what does it look like to love our neighbor? How would we quantify that? How would we, at the end of the day, be able to explain to someone, this is how we fulfilled what Jesus is asking us to do, to love God and love our neighbor. So I think it takes creating a space where you're willing to do some thought work before you start into the measurement. It's so much easier to measure numbers, but we're really not measuring what the impact of what we're doing really is. Dave, what would you add to that?
First of all, I totally agree. And again, I can't believe I keep having to confess things. I mean, I'm a nerd on the numbers in a big way. But Josh has helped me a lot. Josh is way beyond me in terms of his sociological skills and his assessment. But he has come back in almost a pastoral way to all of us in ministry and go, yeah, those are kind of big deals that may or may not help you in the trenches in real relationships with people. And so what is it that helps you? And I live in both worlds. I kind of want to assess the big macro picture, but if I was pushed to try to understand what matters most for me, I'm going to center on one thing. Do lives keep moving towards Jesus when I'm not kind of controlling the time, whether it's a program or the room or whatever? What absent of me and absent of what I'm initiating, are they still moving towards Jesus? And then how would I know that, Kim, to your point? Again, we're going to come back to listening, right? I'm going to come back to asking the right kind of questions, being in the kind of relationship that allows me the kind of close-up proximity and inspection that really makes a difference. We in a national role, we collect data, it rolls up, we give us some landscape. But I still remember, again, filling out those forms back in the early 80s to pass on to somebody else and thinking to myself, okay, they're getting the numbers. They don't know. They can't know. And now back then I was annoyed by that, because, but now I'm going, that's okay. They can't know because I only in relationship and only in that kind of proximity and that availability does it feel like I have a hint of knowing what's really going on. And that would be an example of, like, how do I know that somebody's moving towards Jesus when I'm not around, when they're not responsive to, the meetings that I'm orchestrating? That's a kind of that's my threshold.
That's great. We are moving towards Jesus and hoping that something is going to be different. What do we hope is going to be different? Thank you, both, for that. And I just think about as we are changing what we hope to see in our students, that means we have to change how we communicate our assessments to leadership and all of those types of things. So these are things that emerging youth pastors are going to really have to grapple with, because that's what really matters. Okay, before we close, I want to do a quick rapid fire closing. What is one thing you hope every new youth minister carries into their first ministry context? Who wants to start?
I'll jump in. I hope. Oh wait, rapid fire. I hope that they carry a commitment to being playful and embodied co-learners rather than activities directors. Just really deeply listen to the story. Sit on the floor. Sit on the table. Just walk, on the sidewalk wherever they are, and just don't talk at them. Just create, move, and wander alongside them, and know that the Spirit is probably already there moving where you are, and like let that flourish and rise to the surface too. So, yeah, just walk alongside. Don't just talk at. That would be mine.
Thank you, Lakeisha.
Mine would be that you would pay attention to your own soul formation and that you would be practicing awareness. It's really hard to be in relationship with someone if we haven't done our own work. And it's a lifelong journey. You don't ever stop doing your own work and paying attention and growing closer to the Lord and creating space for Him to be able to speak to you. So I would strongly encourage that you build as many spiritual practices as possible into your repertoire and use them on a daily basis so that you can learn to hear the Lord's voice.
Amen. Thanks.
I'm looking at Ebony right now because she falls in this category for me. Mine would be to have true allies in your journey of wanting to just kind of cling to Jesus and step into every moment with as much of a loving presence as you can. And moment by moment is no small deal. I'd hate to be assessed by moment, but it activates everything in my heart, and I can do that with Jesus and friends like Ebony who go, let's do it with Jesus.
Amen. Thank you, Dave. And for me, it would be, yes, that radical focus on Jesus. We cannot be without that radical focus on Jesus. I want to thank each of our panelists, Lakeisha, Kimberly, Dave, Josh, Brandon, for all of your wisdom, for the research insights, the ministry experience you shared with us today. Your work continues to shape how we think about relational discipleship and the future of faith formation for the young people that we serve. And we are so grateful for the time that you brought to this conversation and the care that you brought to this conversation. And thank you, everyone who joined us. We hope that today's webinar encourages you and challenges your assumptions and equips you with a deeper vision for relational discipleship that is radically centered on Jesus and grounded in real relationships with young people. As a reminder, you can find the white paper at the Future of Faith website. And if this conversation sparks something in you, we want to invite you to continue exploring these themes at the Association of Youth Ministry Educators Conference, October 23rd through 25th in Dallas, Texas. The Relational Discipleship paper will be front and center, and we'll have extended opportunities to learn and collaborate and imagine together what's possible for the next generation. We would love to see you there. Thank you again for investing your time today, and most importantly, for investing in young people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless.